and evaluate the clearance here, which would be approximately 1 millimeter. That will be enough thickness of the ceramic so that it will be very strong under compression and adequately strong during tensile forces. We can upright this burr now and start the margin, which is, in this case, the finish line is a shoulder with a rounded internal, and the burr is pretty good at doing that, so you can hold it upright. And while you still have the burr in the handpiece, you can go ahead and start the beveling procedure. Bevel the sharp edges that you would have across that lingual incisal, and also you could even use it for the facial incisal. So it's important to realize that we are going to need to make sure that this preparation has draw that moves slightly incisally rather than just facially or facial incisal, because the wrap is going to lock us in, and we want to look for areas that might be undercut as we view them from the line of draw that we're establishing. And this is going to necessitate a little bit more reduction of tooth structure than you would do in an incisal butt veneer, which is one of the reasons why I would perform lingual wraps only when they're indicated and not as a routine. So use the burr as you would on a full crown preparation, holding along the long axis of the preparation, and see how well it is leaning towards each other. So the little wall you create on the distal and that proximal wall have to draw together. And it's very easy to make these preparations with undercuts that make it nearly impossible for the technician to fabricate your veneers. So I find when I'm doing lingual wrap veneers that I'm spending a significant amount of time evaluating this line of draw. So we keep assessing and making small adjustments until the preparation meets the line of draw requirements. And it typically happens on the corners, and it happens in the interproximal areas where you'll need to make some modifications. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just continuing to modify, utilizing a fine grit diamond to enhance the surface just a little bit, and then every once in a while getting out an instrument or explorer or something, holding it down at the finish line, making sure I can see it, or if the instrument's being hidden or blocked out by the axial wall above it. So you can take a look here. I'm going to point this out with my RGS instrument that we're still tight on that distal gingival corner relative to that mesial lingual corner, and we're going to need to make some modifications to this preparation in order to make it have an easy draw rather than a difficult draw that barely works. We want to spend a little bit of time really making this work well. One of the great ways you can get draw to improve is to focus your attention to the incisal third rather than the entire wall, because sometimes the problem is just up here at the incisal third and you don't have to prep the entire wall. So I'm just showing you that here with the 8850. Notice that you have a lot more reduction in interproximal. Well, that was required. We need to do that in order to get a good finish line. But the reduction on the facial is quite typical for a veneer. So we continue to make the modifications, assessing, and we want to have a butt joint all the way around, or a shoulder with a rounded internal. You can see with the RGS2 it's not 0.75 millimeters, but it's somewhere between 0.4 and 0.75. Maybe it's a half millimeter or so, right down in that marginal area. And that's approximately what you want to have on that lingual. This is the Vision Flex diamond strip, which will be used to create a little bit of space and also to remove loose enamel rods. And I think at this point, after utilizing the discs and the Jiffy Green, that we're pretty happy with the result. We want to try to make the margins as clean as possible and the surface as smooth as possible. And it's no problem having one veneer as a lingual wrap and another veneer right next to it as an incisal butt, and the one next to that being a facial only veneer. The ceramics can be managed quite well as long as it's all feldspathic. We run into problems to give us 0.5 millimeter depth cuts as we've done in previous videos. And we're also going to be utilizing this Vision Flex disc, which is going to have to be used very, very carefully. So let's get started. We finished the initial part of the facial reduction, and let's rotate this over a little bit so we can kind of see where we're headed. We're going to have to include that wear area, but let's turn our attention to the interproximal preparation first. And once again, the Vision Flex. If you are not using a good finger rest and have the lips protected, this can be a devastating mistake you can make by letting this slip out of your hands. So you want to be extremely careful with this particular disc, but it works really well. We're then going to switch over to the LVS4 because it's a little more narrow than the LVS3, and we're going to push through interproximally. And I want you to see how the burr is pushing straight back at one point here, and I'll show you that right there. And so you're pushing the burr back towards the back of the mouth, straight over this way. There may be an urge to turn the corner as though we were doing a crown preparation like this, but don't do that. So this is actually like a slice preparation. Okay, so after this is completed, let's turn our attention to the incisal reduction. We are going to use a 330 burr for this particular step, and we're going to make these little notches in here, and then we'll be able to produce the area between them. And as we've talked about in the past, we can use this diamond obliquely to remove any irregularities on that incisal area. That's a great trick for smoothing surfaces that have irregularities due to depth cuts. Having finished the incisal reduction, let's turn our attention to lingual, and this is a 379-014, and it's 1.4 millimeters at its widest area, which means we can use about 2/3 of that to determine the proper reduction. In other words, about a millimeter. And you can just work your way across here, remembering that we must create space for the occlusion. So you have to have the patient closely onto this vertical wall. Should be about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. And we're also going to be utilizing, it's going to provide us with significant amount of resistance, which is going to have to be used very, very carefully. Remember, super veneers are indicated when you have less enamel, when you have the margins on the facial that are on the root surface, and we need to have more retention through conventional means in order to hold this in place. It's a little bit like a reverse 3/4 crown, all ceramic, isn't it? You could also use the football-shaped diamonds that I have in the burr kit for this same purpose. Well, it's always a time when the preparation looks kind of ugly, where you've made mistakes and now it's time to correct them, like those line angles on the mesial and distal. After making some corrections, we can recheck the reduction and see that we've accomplished an adequate amount of clearance for the most part. Just needs a little bit more reduction on that distal area. But let's turn our attention to the interproximal preparation first. I want to draw your attention to this distal shelf that I've created on the vertical wall right there, that is there so that I can grab on the more tooth structure. I placed it on the distal because the composite on the mesial side would presumably be undermining the tooth structure if I tried to wrap it around on the mesial side, but I guess you could do that as well. So once again, look for the incisal view and see if you need to make some improvements. We're going to use the KS0F, which is a round-ended, non-tapered, it's parallel, 30 micron grit diamond, and we're going to go ahead and use that to smooth the walls. This is a wonderful burr.
Towards the back of the mouth, straight over this way. There may be an
burr
urge
works
to turn the corner as though we
very
were doing
easily in
a
scallop
like
tissue
this,
areas.
Don't do that. So this is actually like a slice preparation. Okay, so after this is completed, let's turn our attention to the incisal reduction. We are going to use a 330 burr for this particular step, and we're going to make these little notches.
You can use the burr to round off the corners.
We'll be able to
remove
undercuts the area
undercuts
between them,
and generally just make the preparation smoother and nicer. And you know my requirement to have all the finish lines very crisp and very well defined.
And as we've talked
we're
about
doing pretty well.
we can use this diamond.
Let's look at it from the facial, and we look at that undercut from that class 5 and that class 3 that fell out. Well, what are we going to do about that? Well, that's pretty easy actually, because we're just going to block it out with some flowable composite.
Having finished the incisal,
so we protect the adjacent tooth with some of the gas line tape that I showed you in my class 4 video,
and it's 1.4 millimeters.
And we're going to utilize our primer and adhesive,
which means we can
and then
use
place the
about
flowable of a matching shade
of
this stump shade
reduction. In other words, about 1 millimeter. And you can just work your way across here, remembering that we must create space for the occlusion.
I suppose you could also use a hybrid composite.
You have to have the patient close to 5 millimeter depth cuts, as we've done in previous videos. And we're also going to be utilizing this Vision Flex disc, which is going to have to be used very, very carefully. So let's get started.
We're using the slow speed now to do our final refinement. I like to use the burr dry when I'm doing this final refinement step. From the facial, it pretty much looks like an all-ceramic crown, doesn't it?
And let's rotate this over a little bit so we can kind of see where
But from the incisal view, it's a very different story. We look at the RGS3, which is 1 millimeter wide. We know that our finish line is much less than that. It's a lot closer to 0.5, 0.6 millimeters.
Using a good finger rest and have the lips protected, this can be a devastating
We preserved a lot of enamel on that lingual.
Hands, so you want to be extremely careful.
Now, as always, we're going to utilize our finishing sequence
really well.
Utilizing the
We're then going to switch over
OptiDiscs,
to the LVS4,
rounding off corners,
it's a little more narrow
smoothing the
than
surface.
LVS3.
All of these things are done so that the veneer
I want you to see
laboratory procedures will be facilitated.
Straight back at one point here, and I'll show you that right there. And so you're pushing the burr back towards the back of the mouth.
I think the preparation is pretty much finished. Let's take a look.
There may be an urge to turn the corner as though we were doing a crown preparation like this, but
should have no undercuts, should be smooth with continuous finish line all the way around, and the finish line should be close to a bunch line.
So after this is completed,
we can check our facial reduction. Plenty of room for the material and even cutting it back in that incisal area for the addition of feldspathic material. When you start looking at teeth critically, you'll see that oftentimes you don't need to do a full crown and you can do something more conservative, like defects. And I've got a wear facet on the incisal that's exposing dentin. I have an existing, very poorly done class 3 composite on the mesial, and we have a class 5 Remember, super veneers
restoration on the facial,
less enamel.
and so we're going to go ahead and
on the facial
prepare this for the super
surface.
veneer, starting
and
with
we need to have
1.5 to 2 millimeters of incisal
in
reduction.
order to hold this
Super veneers, it may be more than 1.5 to 2
a little bit
millimeters,
like
and
a
that's
reverse
not a
three-quarter
problem because the
crown, all
Emax can
ceramic,
be
isn't
cut
it?
back and layered to look beautiful. If Emax is 3-4 millimeters beyond the incisal edge, not a problem. It's made for that. So
could also
we're
use
going
the
to
football-shaped
not
diamonds
worry
that I
so
have in
much
the burr
about
kit
the
for this
material
instance.
strength in this
Well,
case.
it's always
We're going
a
to worry
time
more about
when the
getting the
preparation looks
tooth
kind of ugly, where
prepared
you
nicely
made
with
mistakes, and now
adequate
it's time
space
to
for
correct
Emax
them,
to be used.
like those line angles on the mesial.
So let's
distal.
continue with the prep.
After making some corrections, we can recheck the reduction and see that we've accomplished an adequate amount of clearance for the most part. Just needs a little bit more reduction on that distal area.
So you can see how I'm using the burr here to go up the
distal
vertical walls
shelf
and
that
I'm
I've
trying
created
to
on the vertical wall right
get the
there.
finish line to
That
follow
is
the
there
gingival
so that I
architecture.
can grab onto more tooth structure.
Reducing
I
off
placed it on
the
the
facial.
distal
Some may
because
ask, well, why didn't I use
the
depth cuts
composite
in this
on the
case?
mesial side would presumably be
I
undermining
usually
the tooth structure
would
if
use
I
depth
tried
cuts, but
to
I
wrap
thought
it around
I'd
on
show
the
you how we
mesial
can
side,
utilize
but I
the
guess you could do
stent
that as well.
without depth cuts
So
to
once
make
again, look
some
for the
adjustments to
incisal
our
view and see if
reduction.
you
So
need
let's
to
go
make
ahead and
some
take a look at that.
improvements. We're
And
gonna
you can
use
see
the
that I've been
KS
working away at
0.5,
this facial,
which is a
but
round-ended,
the reduction is
non-tapered,
completely
parallel,
off. If you look at the
30
distal,
micron grit
it's
diamond.
significantly
And we're gonna go
under-reduced,
ahead
and
and
so
use
is the
that to
mesial for that
smooth the
matter.
walls.
So
This
we're
is a
going to have to
wonderful
spend more time reducing the facial, but the prep guide is an awesome
burr
way
works
to do this in the event that
very easily
you
in scallop tissue
did not
areas.
do depth cuts or you chose not to do depth cuts. Look at that class 3 composite there. That's going to be included in the outline form of this particular preparation. I'm going to break through the interproximal with the 8850
You can use the burr
012.
to round off the corners, remove undercuts, and generally just make the preparation smoother and nicer. And you know my requirement to have all the finish lines very crisp and very well defined. We're doing pretty well. Let's look at it from the facial, and we look at that undercut from that class 5 and that class 3 that fell out. Well, what are we
You can
going to
look
do
at that
about
class 3
Well, that's
composite.
pretty
It
easy,
popped out
actually,
while we were
because
prepping.
We're just going to
And we're
block
going
it
to
out
want
with
to
some
extend the
flowable
outline
composite.
form to include that class 3
So we
composite
protect the
and wrap
adjacent
over
tooth with
the
some of the
lingual
gas line tape
significantly
that
in
I
order to
showed
get
you
more retention
in my class
form.
4 video. And we're going to utilize our primer and adhesive and then place the flowable of a matching
It's amazing
shade
how easy it is
stump
to
shade.
use this interproximal burr without hitting the adjacent tooth, because it just slips right in there quite easily. You can use this also for full crown preparations.
I suppose you could also use a hybrid composite.
Now we switched over to the LVS 3016. The tip of this burr is going to be utilized to form the modified shoulder, or the rounded internal shoulder. We want the
We're using the
angle
slow speed
between
now to
the
do our
shoulder
final
and the
refinement.
unprepared tooth to be approximately 90 degrees, but the internal angle should be rounded. And we're just using the same burr here to extend beyond the margins of the previous class 3 restoration. We're then going to go across the lingual to create a very robust, tall lingual